Once upon a time, in a land of tall towers and golden domes, there lived boys who laughed, played, and dreamed just like any child would. But one day, everything changed. Soldiers came to their villages, not to fight, but to take. They didn't ask, they didn't explain. They simply grabbed the boys and disappeared into the dust. These children, some as young as 7, were told they were chosen, but it was not a blessing. It was the beginning of something dark. They were taken far away to a palace so big it could swallow 100 villages. A place with gold walls, silent halls, and eyes watching from every corner. Inside the palace, everything they knew was stripped away. Their names erased, their clothes burned, their language forbidden. They were given new names, new rules, and new voices they didn't recognize as their own. They were told, "You belong to the Sultan now," as if they were no longer human, but things to be owned. From sunrise to sunset, they were trained to bow, to smile, to serve. No mistakes, no tears, no questions. If they cried, they were beaten. If they hesitated, they were punished. Even their thoughts had to be quiet. They were dressed in fine silk, fed sweet food, and placed in golden rooms. But it wasn't kindness. It was a costume hiding the pain underneath. Some boys tried to hold on to hope, whispering memories of their homes, their mothers, their real names. But each day made it harder to remember. The palace wanted perfect servants, not real children. They were told the Sultan loved them, but what came next didn't feel like love. It felt like something worse. Their voices weren't enough. The palace wanted full control over their hearts, their minds, and their bodies. Some boys wouldn't survive. Others lived, but never truly smiled again. And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the palace demanded even more. The palace had taken their names, their homes, and their voices. But now, it wanted something even deeper. Something no child should ever lose. The boys were told they were going to be purified, a lie hidden behind soft words and fake smiles. What really happened was far more terrifying. One by one, they were led into rooms where no one came out the same. These boys, still growing, still learning, were forced to go through something called castration. Their bodies were cut, not for health, not for choice, but to make sure they could never become men. The pain was unbearable. Many didn't survive. Those who did, they woke up changed forever. The palace called them eunuchs now. They were no longer just servants. They were symbols of loyalty. Because without manhood, the empire believed they couldn't love, couldn't rebel, couldn't desire power. They were safe, controlled, silent. It didn't matter how much they cried. In fact, they were punished for showing pain. If they screamed, no one came. If they bled, they were left to heal or die in silence. Some tried to escape, but where would they run? They were alone. No name, no past, no future outside those golden walls. The worst part? The palace praised them. "Look how loyal they are," they would say. "So obedient, so calm." But that calm was fear. That loyalty, forced. These boys didn't smile because they were happy. They smiled because they were afraid not to. They walked straight, not out of pride, but because they were trained like puppets. Even their thoughts had to follow the rules. Some were told they had a chance to rise, to become powerful inside the palace. But what is power when you've already lost everything that made you, you? Their suffering was hidden behind velvet curtains and fancy titles. The world saw silk robes. The boys felt scars. And still, the palace wanted more. Obedience wasn't enough. Survival wasn't enough. What came next would break what little was left inside them. Because now,
They weren't just silent. They were being prepared for something far more personal and far more horrifying.
After the pain, after the silence, after their bodies were changed forever, the boys were dressed in gold. Not real freedom, not joy, just more rules covered in silk. The palace wanted them to look perfect, like walking decorations. Their new life was inside walls so high they could never see the world beyond them again. They woke up early, stood for hours without speaking, and served food they were never allowed to taste. They learned how to walk slowly, bow deeply, and smile even when they felt nothing inside. Every movement was trained, timed, and tested. Even how they breathed felt controlled. The rooms were shiny, the air smelled sweet, and everything looked soft and rich. But the boys knew better. It was all a disguise. A cage made of beauty is still a cage, and they were the birds with clipped wings. Some boys served the Sultan directly. They were told this was a great honor, but serving the Sultan meant being watched constantly, never making a mistake, and always pretending to be happy. If they dropped a plate or spoke too soon, they were beaten. If they dared to ask a question, they were reminded they had no right to speak. Some were sent into the harem, the hidden world inside the palace where the Sultan's wives and concubines lived. No men were allowed there. Only the boys, now eunuchs, were trusted. They became messengers, guards, and silent watchers. But the rules were even stricter. They couldn't look at the women too long. They couldn't talk unless ordered to. Every day was like walking on glass. They were told they were safe, but the truth was simple. No one was ever safe. There were quiet moments too. Moments when a boy might remember the sound of his mother's voice or hum a tune he heard as a child. But those memories were fading fast. The palace didn't just take their freedom, it slowly erased who they were. Year by year, the older boys taught the new ones how to survive. But surviving wasn't living. It was hiding, smiling when your heart was breaking, nodding when you wanted to scream. And just when they thought they had learned all the palace could demand from them, something new began. A darker role, a different kind of service, one that would blur the line between pain and power.
Just when the boys thought they had learned how to survive the palace, everything changed again. They were no longer just servants or quiet shadows in gold robes. The palace wanted more. It wanted their loyalty, and now their bodies too. Some boys were chosen, hand-picked by the palace officials and brought closer to the Sultan himself. They were told this was a great honor, the highest reward a servant could get. But behind the soft words and sweet perfume was something much darker. These boys weren't being rewarded, they were being groomed. Step by step, they were trained how to please, not just serve. They were taught how to move gracefully, how to speak softly, how to make themselves small but perfect. They were bathed in expensive oils, dressed in the finest silk, and placed in private rooms where they waited for the Sultan, or one of his favorites, or someone else in power who wanted something more than obedience. They were told, the Sultan cares for you, but the truth was he used them. Some boys were touched, others were taken. Their fear was ignored, their pain was hidden. What happened in those rooms stayed locked behind gold doors and quiet walls. The ones who pleased the Sultan were given special treatment, better food, better rooms, maybe even protection. And for a moment they believed they were rising in power, but they weren't free.
They were just favored prisoners. Their chains were softer, but still chains. Some of the younger boys watched this and learned fast. They tried to copy the favored ones. They hoped to be picked next, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't want to suffer worse. That's how the cycle kept going. The abused became teachers. The trauma became tradition. Pain was passed down like a secret recipe, hidden behind fake smiles and forced silence. And the worst part? No one outside the palace ever knew. No history book wrote their names. No statue stood in their memory. The palace called it loyalty, the world called it power. But the boys knew what it really was. It was survival, but at what cost?
For years, they walked the palace halls like ghosts. They smiled when told, obeyed when broken, and disappeared when no longer useful. Some died young, some grew old in silence, but none were remembered. The empire they served wrote songs for its kings, carved statues for its warriors, painted golden walls for its sultans. But for the boys, nothing. No names, no graves, no history. They served an empire that never remembered their names. Their stories were buried on purpose, not lost, buried, locked away in the quiet pages of history books that only spoke of glory, not the cost. The archives talked about power, strategy, and victory, but they never spoke of the boys who were taken, who were changed, who were used. No one wrote down the number of children who didn't survive the castration. No one counted how many cried themselves to sleep each night behind palace walls. And even now, in the modern world, people still speak of the Ottoman Empire like it was only about greatness and gold. They forget or ignore what was hidden behind the velvet curtains. But that pain didn't vanish. It became part of history's shadow, a wound no one wanted to look at. Yet the legacy still lives, in the silence of boys taught not to cry, in cultures where power is still confused with control, in people who were never told the full truth of where they came from. That's why these stories matter, now more than ever. Because when we forget those who were used and erased, we allow that pain to repeat itself again and again. The boys weren't weak, they were survivors. Even when stripped of everything, they held on to tiny pieces of who they were. A song, a memory, a whisper. That bravery deserves to be remembered, not for pity, but for truth, for healing. And so, today we say their names, even if history forgot them. We see their pain, even if the empire hid it. And we carry their story, not in silence, but in fire. Because behind every golden empire is a cost, and these boys paid it, alone, afraid, forgotten, but not anymore.